All right, so in terms of building triads, let's go ahead and build the main ones that we tend to think about in terms of qualities based on this note G, as I've got represented on the alto clef. So, of those qualities, the four that we tend to recognize most commonly are the major triad, the minor triad, the diminished triad, and the augmented triad. So each of these triads has three different notes, and there's going to be a commonality above them. We're going to have a note that serves as the root of the chord, and then above the root of the chord, we're going to have a note that serves as the third of the chord. And then above that, we're going to have the fifth of the chord. Now, in order to understand kind of the construction of the triads, of the triad types, and kind of how each of these qualities gets its name, the best way to think about that is to think about both of these upper notes here in terms of being related to the kind of the main note, so to speak, of the triad, the main note of the chord or the root. And I say that because sometimes we tend to think about triads as being kind of these stacked thirds. So we have a root that's here, and then a third above that is a third, and a third above that is the fifth. And you can certainly sort of get there by thinking of it that way, but in terms of explaining how triads actually operate, it actually tends to be more useful of the third being above the root and then the fifth being above the root. In both cases, we're measuring those notes from the root of the chord, okay? And so let's kind of see how that looks when we're constructing now each of our qualities of triad. So for the major triad, what we're going to do is I like to start with the fifth. So we're going to have a fifth above our root, but we want to think about the quality of that fifth. The quality of the fifth that we're going to have between our root and our fifth in a major triad is in fact a perfect fifth, which we have here already as it stands, right? So we have a G, and then above that is a D, and we know from our study of intervals that that forms a perfect fifth between these two notes here. Okay, so I'm going to measure the fifth first, and I kind of think of that fifth as being sort of the framing, right? Or kind of maybe you can think of it as like the hallway, so to speak. And then we need to fill in that frame with our third. So the third that we're going to have in a major triad is going to be a major third, as we see here between our G and our B, which again we know from intervals that forms a major third. So when we're thinking about how to understand our different chord qualities or different triad qualities, I like to think of them, each one of them, in terms of what kind of fifth do we have and what kind of third we have, right? So in a major triad, the hallmark of that is we have a perfect fifth, and I think about it as framing a major third, okay? So that's a major triad. So now the minor triad is going to be similar to the major triad in that both of them are going to be framed by this perfect fifth. The difference then occurs with the third. Instead of having a major third, as we did with a major triad, the minor triad uses a minor third. So we're going to go ahead and lower this to a B flat, and that gives us now a minor third. So that's the defining differentiation between a major triad and a minor triad. Both triads have a perfect fifth kind of forming our frame, but whereas the major triad then has a major third above the root, the minor triad has a minor third above the root. Now looking at the diminished triad, the big differentiator here is now we're going to go ahead and start messing around, so to speak, with the quality of the fifth. Whereas we have a perfect fifth that frames a major triad and a minor triad, the way we get this name diminished to define the whole quality of the chord really has to do with what we're going to do with the fifth now. We're now going to make that fifth, instead of being perfect, we're going to make it a diminished fifth, which for our purposes now means that the D needs to be flat. right? Again, thinking back to our study of intervals, we still need to have the generic interval, so to speak, of a fifth. So a G, a fifth above that, is always going to be some kind of D, no matter what kind of fifth it is. And since we're going to shrink that space of a perfect fifth by half a step, then the next smaller fifth we have is the diminished fifth. So in a diminished triad, we're going to have as our frame a diminished fifth. And then now we need to think about the third. We have a diminished fifth, but then we also in the middle there have a minor third for a diminished triad. And then finally, moving on to the augmented triad, or the augmented triad, like the diminished triad, is going to change the quality of the fifth. The perfect fifth we had framing the major and minor triads, we took that fifth and shrank it by half a step to make it a diminished fifth in the diminished triad. So for the augmented, we're going to do exactly the opposite and extend that space. We're going to stretch it out a little bit. But remember, because we need to maintain that generic interval of the fifth between, in this case, G and D, we need to keep the naming of the D to be a D something while also stretching the overall spacing by half a step. So now rather than having a perfect fifth, we're going to have an augmented fifth by making the D into a D sharp. And now as far as the quality of the third, we're going to go ahead and use a major third from the root. So in this case, that's already accounted for with the B natural. So an augmented triad includes a major third surrounded by an augmented fifth. And so now here we have them all laid out. These are all examples of the four common types of triads based on G in terms of being our root here. So here's a G major triad, G minor triad, a G diminished triad, and a G augmented triad. So once again, in each example, we've used G as our root, right? In our major and minor triads, that root then takes on a perfect fifth. The difference being that in a major triad, the third is going to be a major third, whereas in a minor triad, the third is going to be a minor third. In a diminished triad, we have that minor third, but in this case, it's framed by a diminished fifth, whereas in an augmented triad, we have an augmented fifth framing a major third. And this is the case. This is going to be the relationships, the framing, so to speak, the interval building, no matter what our root is. Again, in this case, we've used G, but this will apply no matter which note is our root.